All right, welcome panelists. So we're going to move on to our panel on digital regulation and competition policy in the Indo-Pacific. NBR has been doing a lot of research on these issues over the past year, which the panelists will get more into. I would like to quickly introduce my colleague, Jonathon Marek, who will be moderating this panel. Jonathon is the Assistant Director of our Technology and Geoeconomic Affairs team and is an expert in a wide range of areas, including economic security, data policy, intellectual property, and emerging technologies. So with that, over to you, Jonathon.
Thanks, Doug. Really looking forward to this conversation. You know, a couple of years ago, digital regulation might have fit well into the second post-lunch spot as kind of a sleepy, under-discussed topic. That's very much not the case now, particularly with what we've seen out of the Trump administration. So really looking forward to the conversation, and we have an all-star lineup of panelists who I will run through and introduce and then turn it over to them for their remarks. So first up, we have Laura Sahlstrom, who is founding partner of ThinkTech Policy Consulting. She has over 30 years of experience advising Fortune 500 companies, as well as governments, on data policy, intellectual property, AI, and business regulations. She's previously held key roles in the U.S. at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and in the Indo-Pacific, where she helped stand up BSA's Asia-Pacific office in Singapore. She also currently lectures at Duke University. Nigel Cory is Director of Digital Trade and Technology Policy at Crowell Global Advisors, a leading global policy advisory firm where he specializes in data, cloud, and tech governance, the development and impact of new and emerging technologies like AI, and the geopolitical dynamics shaping competition and cooperation around data and digital technology. His work explores how these areas intersect with digital trade and the broader digital economy. And in that context, he's a member of the OECD's Data Free Flow with Trust expert community, as well as being a non-resident fellow here at NBR. And then finally, we've heard from Tammy earlier this morning, but for those of you who have forgotten her countless experiences and great things that have prepared her for this panel. She's a partner at DGA Group Government Relations, where she draws on more than 3 decades of experience working in Asia to advise clients on investment and trade issues, particularly with South Korea, but also the broader Asia-Pacific region. She most recently served as Senior Director at McLarty Associates, and previously also served as Senior Vice President for Asia and President of the U.S.-Korea Business Council at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where she represented U.S. businesses during negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Earlier in her career, Tammy spent 14 years as president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea, where she helped grow the bilateral trade relationship and supported the completion and ratification of CORUS. And Tammy is a member of NBR's Board of Advisors. So with that, I'll turn it over to Laura.
Hi. Is it on? Yes, we're turned on. Well, one of the problems with speaking at this time of day is not only is your food still digesting and you haven't had your coffee, but also that all of the good ideas have been spoken by one panelist or another. So I am going to try to put a little different spin on some of these things and have been asked today to kick us off by talking about geopolitical implications in the region and the impact those are having on how regulations are developed in the region. So 2 things that I heard today that I want you to keep in mind as I talk about these geopolitical influences are first, a lot of conversation about trust. And I did pull some data points before I arrived today, trying to understand what is the trust perspective in the region, particularly vis-a-vis China and the U.S. The sources, I think, are not entirely reliable, so let me mention that. But interestingly, and in 2025 data, so perhaps this has changed in a year, the trust of the United States is slightly more than trust of China, so 47% to about 43%. That shifts depending on which country you're looking at in the Asia-Pacific region, with North Asian countries tending to trust the U.S. and U.S. policymaking more than Southeast Asian countries. So keep keep that in mind. The other thing is trust in technology. So the statistical data there is a little bit, I think, less impressive, but anecdotally, it appears that there still is higher trust in US technology makers than there is in Chinese technology makers. That is more true, interestingly, with respect to physical infrastructure than it is with respect to platforms. And I think that is a key and interesting point that we see evolve from some of the geopolitical dynamics. So the biggest shift in the region over the last few years has been in the interplay between the US and China. So I think we had one of our speakers earlier today talk about how China is generally viewed as reliable. I think in the technology sector, that's actually been challenged a little bit, especially as we see more and more platforms and more data collection. So the reliability of China as Chinese companies as entities that are trustworthy with respect to data is shifting. But China is providing alternative technology to the United States, and that's important to policymakers and companies in the region. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a substantial shift in how the US addresses trade policy. And of course, that has been mentioned several times today. I think, though, that it bears more emphasis because it does tag the United States with less trust in terms of its messaging and how it presents itself as an ally in the region, and also a source of technology in the region. So on trade, the perception has definitely shifted from one that is positive and constructive to one that is primarily negative, and that is more increasingly integrated with national security. The other interesting move by not just this administration, but previous administrations is more focus on export controls with respect to technology. So that again raises uncertainty, and it encourages governments to rethink dependency on the US and US supply chains. There's also a conflicting set of messages that are being telegraphed that also cross over into the trade area with respect to how innovation and how technology is developed. So direct US government involvement in industrial policy, walking away from trade-based rules or free trade as a primary methodology to promote tech models has generated a series of questions around the world. And so keeping that in mind with the trust and kind of how policy is being developed in the region and globally, let's now think a bit about technology and technology's evolution. So where is technology at this moment in time? So these geopolitical factors are running into where we are, I think, in a pivot or a moment with respect to technology. One is that technology is national security. There's no doubt about that anymore. Interestingly, China has made that argument for decades, and their policy has been focused with that in mind. But especially with the Iran war now, you see the importance of technology with respect to national security issues. That national security perception is driving reactions from regulators, and that is why we are seeing more use of the term digital sovereignty, and digital sovereignty in all of its definitions, and digital sovereignty at all points of the stack. So doubling down on data localization, which is something that had been happening well before this point that we are in time, also heavily focused on infrastructure. So creating partnerships with the US, but also making investments in order to develop independent infrastructure, particularly as it relates to AI, and then looking at compute power. And I think India is an interesting case study because they have declared that their government is going to develop an LLM. The second point of evolution in the tech industry, and this was mentioned by Microsoft earlier today, is that we are at a heightened point of tech dependency globally. But at the same time, we're at an increased level of diminished trust, not just in the countries that we're dealing with from a regulatory and security perspective, but also in tech as an entity that we depend on. So the tendency of regulators then is to need to control, to diversify, and to build our own, I think is another formula that's existing here. We had a lot of conversations today about AI. I think the third significant movement right now is that we are in a moment with AI where some countries are viewing it as an existential threat. I don't think that that is necessarily the case in the Asia-Pacific region. This is a region that has a significantly higher level of trust in technology generally. But there is an acknowledgement that AI creates a dependency, again, going back to the national security issues that require regulating. And then the fourth point that I want to make before I turn over to these guys is that we are now in the technology regulatory sphere at a 30-year point, really, at least in my career. That's how long I've been doing this. But for 30 years, regulators have been trying to figure out how to regulate technology. And it has never been the case that they have been able to keep ahead of technology patterns or what is happening with technology. And probably that is not something that is possible or realistic given the pace of technological change. But now that we have this buildup of frustration, the confluence of the national security issues and the addition of AI and the fast pace of it, we are beginning to see regulatory reactions in the region that include shifts in how regulators approach regulation. So there is an increased tendency to, for example, provide liability to platforms, which is something that had been kind of off limits in the past in an effort to develop local platforms. We're also seeing ex-ante competition, which you guys are going to talk about, and more regulatory and risk-based approaches to regulation. So the desire to be a little more predictive in the type of regulation that is being issued. There's also a propensity then to modeling, trying to find alternative models. And the EU was discussed as an alternative model. I think there's a lot of interest in that. I personally have had 3 conversations with ASEAN regulators in the last 6 months where they specifically asked about EU approaches to this. I don't think it will be predominant in the region because this is not a reactive region. It is a region that tends to be very thoughtful and very strategic. It won't be pure Europe transformation, but there is an interest there. And then the final point is digital sovereignty. And again, digital sovereignty is really a representation of all of these concerns, of fears, of the diminished trust that is happening and the desire to have more control.
G'day. I feel my first statement is that we've had an over-indexing of Australians here today, so I'll try and base my perspective on an Asia-Pacific one. Really great, following on from a lot of smart speakers and thoughts, and so I'm just trying to put the pieces together. But Laura did a great job of connecting it in terms of what we're dealing with a region that's struggling, obviously, to adapt domestically to a shift in priorities. In and around the rise of economic and national security while they continue to struggle to adapt to ever-changing technology. And where do they look for references and guides and models to figure out how do they address what they're trying to get at? And this isn't new to sort of global digital governance, but it's obviously taken on more importance and it's gotten more complicated given the nature of geopolitics and trade policy. And so I think building on from Laura's point, looking at some of the regional dynamics, especially of competition, but broader digital policy, and then specifically what I've been doing with NBR in Korea, but more generally to pass it on to Tammy to speak more specifically about Korea. But with NBR, I've been involved with a really interesting project. One of the more interesting in my career, working with think tanks. Before my current role, I was 9 years at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, so I've been doing this a long time, but I've never gotten as much traction or as much attention from a specific report like I've gotten on looking at the nature of Korean discriminatory competition policy, given the geopolitical US-Korea trade context. And so it was really interesting because it's gotten renewed attention, but it's an old issue. Like US firms have had a hard go of it, to say the least, in Korea for a long time. But in the context of, obviously, the Trump administration's revised approach to trade and the ever-growing importance of technology and trade and sort of cooperation with like-minded allies, where there's got comparative advantages on both sides, it's even more pressing now than ever to sort of address some of these long-standing issues and to sort of do the faux pas of answering my own question to the last panel to build on Andrew's point. Like, I mean, Korea's cloud and cybersecurity policy didn't make sense 5 years ago, and it makes even less sense now, and how it treats US cloud providers and how it is based on sort of local control and local data and local algorithms and such. And so, but in the current trade context, all of these issues take on greater importance. And it's obviously there's the intersection with industrial policy goals in Korea, which Tammy will talk about. But basically, in the current context of talks, competition policy with an administration that is really prioritising digital non-tariff barriers, it's an opportunity to level set on some of these longer standing issues, so the two sides can focus on actually what they do really well together. But it's obviously there's a lot of domestic politics and history that's tied up into why Korea does what it does from a regulatory perspective. And obviously, Korea is a close adherent to the EU's approach to competition policy. They're nearly sort of in some regards out-EU the EU when it comes to competition policy. And that's problematic in what they've done in many regards. And there's a clear pattern in how they have done this in targeting US firms. And US firms really struggle because they lack due process and procedural fairness protections in Korea. And following on from how they're treated now, there's the prospect of new legislation in relation to platform regulation that would actually just make that situation worse. But you put all of that inside the context of highly charged trade and technology and geopolitical sort of negotiations between the US and Korea at the moment, and there's a lot there. And so with this NBR report, we conducted a series of anonymous interviews with US firms that have been dealing with Korean competition regulators for many years about their experience and the patterns here. I've testified in Congress. Doug Strube and I had the pleasure of traveling to the home of the KFTC in Sejong and getting the windowless hot room treatment from Korean regulators that US firms complain about. And then getting a lot of Korean media and government attention from the reporting and the criticism I've been involved with in trying to lay out a path forward. And so it's been really interesting, and it goes to the value of NBR's engagement on these issues and trying to get the parties together in a way that provides a platform for them, again, to do what they do better. But it's also indicative of this tension that we find elsewhere in the region, and it's beyond competition policy, although that's obviously a key focal point in terms of how countries adopt their own approach to competition and whether they do follow sort of a threshold-based approach, which tends to be discriminatory, and how do they get at some of these technology and competition issues in a way that's neutral and non-discriminatory. But then also, how do they do that with AI, cybersecurity, data privacy, digital trade, industrial policy, national security, CII, everything. And it's complicated. And to build on Laura's point, like I was talking with one of the lead engagers with the drafter of the Vietnamese AI laws draft decree, which the Vietnamese AI law is really something. And that when I made the point of like, hey, what are some comparative models we could bring to the discussion to show an alternative like Japan or such, and they're not interested. Vietnam will regulate how Vietnam wants to regulate. And that's the extension of what Laura meant, like that they will pick and choose, but these countries will set their own course. And so all we can do really from a think tank perspective is provide the evidence and the analysis and the advocacy to try and help point them the best way forward using case examples and such elsewhere, because like, for example, what Vietnam's trying to do would be a really bad model. In the critical determination of what is a high-risk AI, they remain committed to scoping in general purpose AI. And so if everything's high risk, what isn't sort of like, how does it, what makes that special? How do you apply sort of proportionate sort of rules to truly high risk applications of AI? And so we have this battle country by country of how they develop their own approach using case examples from outside the region where applicable in trying to get them to a point that is interoperable or provide some degree of regulatory coherence with their like-minded partners, whether in the region or in the United States and elsewhere. And so it's a challenging dynamic to do this because there's a lot of domestic factors involved in this. There's a lot of historical determination involved in this, and domestic regulators have always struggled to connect what they're doing domestically to automatically align it with what they need to do internationally. And so that's the challenge that we all operate in, to try and help them bridge that gap, bring in best practices and examples to help them hopefully get it right at the start, because it's obviously much harder to try and retrospectively fix it once there's a law in place. And so the project with Korea has been really interesting. Can only hope the trade talks there lead to a more constructive outcome on competition policy, on cloud. We've already seen the issue of mapping data addressed. And so to try and get the two sides aligned on a regulatory basis, because that would then make it much easier for them to work together on AI and semiconductors and everything else. But at that point, I'll hand it over to Tammy to dig into Korea.
Oh, thanks very much, Nigel, and thanks to NBR for this timely, constructive conversation. I do want to point to something you said about the Google Maps issue being addressed. It is in the process of being addressed, and we hope that after 19 years, we can finally get it past the finish line. I reached out to Karan Bhatia, the head of Google's government affairs, to congratulate him when I saw the initial news, and he said, thank you and progress for sure, but it's not there yet, so we'll continue to work. I've been asked to talk about Korea and share a little context for you. And I thought I'd start by pointing out that in 2012, Korea and the United States implemented a free trade agreement, a comprehensive high standard FTA that took tariffs in both countries to almost zero. Then President Trump is reelected and has his Liberation Day, where he applied tariffs on almost all of our trading partners. South Korea was hit with 25%. We are in violation of our free trade agreement. But South Korea, like most countries, aware that the U.S. is violating our agreement, decided to continue with their commitments and to try to make the best of it. At the time, Korea got 25% tariff. These are the reciprocal under IEEPA, which the Supreme Court has subsequently knocked down. But at that time, Japan got 24% and the EU got 25%. And these are important to South Korea because those are their main competitors, particularly in the area of autos. So Korea very keen to ensure whatever happens going forward, they're in the same general ballpark with their neighbors. Now, I should also point out that for the first half of last year, South Korea did not have an elected president. For those of you who don't follow it so closely, December 3rd of 2024, former President Yoon declared martial law. Within hours, and he did this at like 10:30 p.m. at night, and then within hours, the National Assembly had gathered a quorum and had rescinded martial law. And a couple of days later, they impeached him. And so for half of last year, no elected president. South Korea was also hosting APEC last year. APEC is that grouping of 21 economies in Asia. That's a period, basically over 200 meetings throughout the year. I see you, Alex. He survived APEC. And thank you for all the work you did there. But South Korea did an incredible job, again, without an elected president. So on June 3rd, Lee Jae-myung is elected. No transition period. Next day, he takes over, and he's trying to deal with these tariffs, these 25% tariffs. He had his first summit with President Trump on August 25th. And that morning, President Trump sent a very provocative Truth Social posting saying, what's South Korea doing, attacking churches and going into U.S. military bases that could have knocked and when I saw the tweet, I thought, oh my goodness, this meeting is not going to go well. But President Lee, to his huge credit, went in there and carefully explained what the Korean government was doing. They weren't violating any laws. They were following up on investigations from the martial law, and President Trump was satisfied. So then they have their second summit in Gyeongju during APEC on October 29th, where South Korea secured a tariff going forward of 15%, which is great. Japan got 15%. The EU has 15%, so Korea's feeling good. And in exchange for that, South Korea agreed on a $350 billion investment package. $150 billion of that's going to go into shipbuilding. The U.S. is way behind. China is way ahead on shipbuilding, but South Korea is going to help us rejuvenate our shipbuilding and help us become competitive again. And the other $200 billion is in critical and emerging technologies, things like AI, like quantum. So this is, again, very good. And they did all that for half the year without a president. And I should also inform you all that before this agreement, South Korea was already one of the largest foreign investors in the United States. Before Trump's tariffs, South Korea, all of their major companies were already hugely investing in America. During 2023 and 2024, Korea was the largest greenfield investor in the U.S. We're talking autos, batteries, semiconductors, white goods, nuclear power, data centers, critical minerals, steel, and Hanwha Oceans bought Philly Port. So lots of money already coming in. Now, switching back to digital, I'm a little bit worried. I've been doing U.S.-Korea relations for almost 40 years, and I'm getting concerned that the mood in Washington about South Korea is beginning to turn a little bit negative. An American technology company called Coupang, that Ambassador Hollyman mentioned a little bit about earlier this morning, had a data leak, a major data leak, and they notified the Korean government on November 29th. By Christmas Day, the Blue House, which is the Korean version of the White House, had called an emergency meeting on Coupang and established an emergency task force. Then on December 30th and December 31st, the Korean National Assembly, they have 11 committees in that National Assembly. 6 of them held a 2-day extraordinary hearing on Coupang. So from my perspective, and again, I've watched data leaks are not unique to Korea. They're not unique to Coupang. They happen. And in Korea, we saw Korea Telecom, SK had a leak. And the Korean government has maintained the position that Coupang is being treated like every other company in Korea. But I have to say, from my experience, the data doesn't really support that. I gave you the timeline about how quickly, strategically and surgically, the Korean government had come after this company. We saw a lot of really inflammatory language from the president, the prime minister, the minister of science and technology, a bunch of National Assembly members saying things like, maybe we should drive them out of business. Or maybe we should suspend their license and push their customers to Korean companies. One of my friends in the Korean government said, Tammy, how do you know all this? Well, Google Translate. And actually that 2-day hearing, it was on YouTube. So I got to watch a lot of it firsthand. Now this company, what Coupang, again, from my perspective, I think they haven't handled it perfectly either. They've made some mistakes. But from my perspective, Coupang needs Korea. Over 90% of their revenue is generated there. And Korea needs Coupang. I say that because almost every adult in Korea has a Coupang account, and they use it to order everything from new Nike tennis shoes to groceries. My sister used to live in Korea until late last year. I would stay at her house at 10 p.m. I'd look in her fridge and there's no cream for my coffee. I cannot drink coffee without cream. She goes on Coupang at 10 p.m. at night. By 6 a.m., there's cold cream outside her door. They do that all over the Republic. It's a phenomenal service. Now, some of my Korean friends also say that the Korean government only cares about Coupang because of really good U.S. lobbying. And I think there's a little misunderstanding there. Coupang last year helped thousands of American companies access the Korean market, and they helped them. We're talking $5.5 billion worth of U.S. exports. All 50 states, almost every congressional district has American companies that are using this online platform service to export into Korea. That was almost 8% of U.S. exports last year used the Coupang bridge to get into South Korea. Now, of course, thousands of Korean small and medium-sized companies also use that Coupang bridge to reach Korean consumers. So that's why I think both sides, they need each other. They need to resolve the issue because it's taking up a lot of air for American officials. And unfortunately, as I remind U.S. officials, Coupang is not the only problem we have in digital. There's something called CSAP. Cloud Services Cloud Services Assurance Plan, thank you, CSAP, and that's where for the public sector, the U.S. companies, and again, we have some great cloud service providers, Microsoft, Google, Amazon Web Services, and there we are only accessing maybe 5% of the public sector, which is, in my view, a little bit shocking. And the rules and the regulations that we believe are keeping our companies out, we're able to work through most of them, but there's one called physical separation. They want the data stored in Korea. And it's not always economically efficient for our companies to do that for a market this size. But we're learning a lot of lessons from the Ukraine war. And one of the lessons, it's resonating with my Korean friends now, is that the evacuation of data before a war. Apparently, Ukraine, a couple months before Russia attacked, had gone to the U.S. trusted cloud service providers. They used Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. And so apparently data centers become great military targets, and the Ukraine data centers were damaged. But because they had gone to the trusted U.S. cloud, their data was safe. So they were able to maintain all of their financial, their medical, their public sector records. So I'm hoping that will help open some new discussions with our South Korean friends. But I want to read one long sentence to you that was in the statement last year after the second summit, where President Trump and President Lee met in Korea. And the quote, "The U.S. and Korea commit to ensure that U.S. companies are not discriminated against and do not face unnecessary barriers in terms of laws and policies concerning digital services, including network usage fees, online platform regulations, and to facilitate cross-border transfer of data, including for location, reinsurance, and personal data." So that sentence, both governments agreed to. And what I'm beginning to hear in Washington, not just from the administration, but from a lot of members of Congress, is they feel like Korea is beginning to backslide on these rules and regulations. So that's something, while I'm concerned about it, ultimately, I'm an optimist with U.S.-Korea relations because of how well we're doing. And I want to leave you with something very positive, and that's that over the last few months, I've seen more major U.S. CEOs going to Korea. NVIDIA's chairman, Jensen Huang, OpenAI, Sam Altman, AMD, Lisa Su, Palantir, Eric, whose last name I can't remember, Meta, Zuckerberg. They've all been to Korea in the last few months, meeting with Samsung, meeting with LG, meeting with Hyundai, meeting with SK Hynix. So I am very optimistic for the future. The other point I would leave you with is that Korea also looks at the European approach to digital regulation. And to my Korean friends, I encourage them to read a 2024 report by Mario Draghi, where he talks about the reason that he thinks the Europeans aren't as competitive in the digital sector is because of over-regulation, heavy regulation. And then I asked my Korean friends, can you name some European online platform companies? Nobody can come up with anyone. And I'm like, don't you remember Spotify? Spotify is Swedish, so there's one. But, you know, Korea has Naver, Kakao. Many companies consider Coupon Korean because 90% of their business is generated there, but it is truly an American company. But South Korea has a innovative ecosystem, and I don't want them to lose that. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you all for your remarks. Makes my job easy as a moderator. I'll pick up right where Tammy left off. You know, we're looking at kind of these influential models or approaches to digital regulation that have an impact. Who might Indo-Pacific countries like Korea look toward? Who is doing a good job on this, and what are some elements of various models that could be emulated and kind of become influential in the region?
I mean, I think Japan in general is doing a pretty good job. They've taken notions from the EU, but obviously stripped out some of the more problematic elements. Obviously, always Singapore. I mean, Singapore strives to sort of set a regional example on AI governance, cybersecurity, agentic AI, cloud, digital trade. They're always going to be a regional reference point. The particular, I mean, and it's important to have alternative models because this is coming from someone that spent far too much time working on data localization and pointing out how bad it is that it's no longer useful to engage policymakers on the negatives. You have to provide constructive alternatives. You can't just say, don't do this. You have to point towards constructive alternatives. And they're starting to emerge. And we need to shift the debate from being as if the EU is the only example out there. And I mean, it's really hard, I feel, for US government officials in their engagement is that they often struggle and have long struggled in advocating for alternative approaches because they don't have the reference materials in US laws and regulations to often apply. And so, for example, in the Vietnam AI case, though, I've heard from US government officials that they've had traction in using like the OMB guidance on the use of AI in the federal government as a reference point for engagement to try and point them away from the more problematic elements. So there are alternative. It just takes more work, in part also because the EU is a very good salesman for their approach, and they are very consistently and actively engaged in pretty much every major digital regulatory discussion in the region. It's just incumbent upon obviously US industry and others to be similarly engaged and provide sort of all the viewpoints and the data to help ensure that when they're weighing up their options to figure out their own way through, that they have a broader selection and a more accurate sort of set of options that weigh out with the trade-offs involved in whether you follow one particular approach or another.
I think I'll add to that, maybe in a little bit of the continuation of depression that was happening in the earlier panel. The bigger models that have been out there are kind of choice of EU, US, or China, and not just in terms of specifically AI regulation, but also in how we innovate and create technology. Traditionally the US is an innovation market, and certainly US platforms and US technology resulted in what it did, both because of talent, because of capital, but also because of no regulation. The ugly truth, right? The wild, wild west worked here in terms of innovation. China as an innovation model is interesting, but I don't think it's replicatable because of the population size in that market, the control and investment resources that the government has. It's not really something that translates well. And the EU, as both of these guys have correctly said, is not a good standard for innovation. So really it's what is your objective in the regulation? Is your objective to control the technology? Is your objective to innovate? And if it is to innovate, then we have a lot of mixed messages these days about how to innovate, including from the U.S. government that's actively engaging in industrial policy and investing in countries and kind of throwing up the whole idea of how we thought we innovated in this market. So there are interesting lessons out there. And there's a whole world of potential in this, including, by the way, some Japanese and Korean models that have had mixed approaches to innovation in the past. So I think that is changing. And then the regulatory models were all working together.
I would also note that another concern I have in Korea is the Korea Fair Trade Commission. And if y'all haven't read Nigel's study that's over there, I really recommend it. He did a great job interviewing American companies and anonymously and getting their response about how things actually operate there. The new president, Lee Myung-bak, has been clear that he wants a very strong KFTC. At the end of each year, the major organizations of the Korean government meet with the president and tell him their plan for the next year. And when the KFTC had met with President Lee, he said he wanted to hire 167 new people for 2026. And President Lee said, no, I think you need more like 500. So, and that's been reported. He said that once last year and again in January. That makes American and frankly, my Korean chaebol friends are also equally nervous because having a more muscular Korea Fair Trade Commission, those folks are going to be doing more investigations. And, one of the the way the KFTC operates isn't unique in Korea to just the Fair Trade Commission. The National Tax Service investigates in a similar manner. The National Customs Service, by these sort of heavy-handed dawn raids, they come in and we're going to find something. And I think it's a leftover remnant from, the Korean economy was a command-controlled economy. The government really, in the early years, helped determine winners and losers because they had such limited resources. They had to channel things and they had to make very tough decisions. And those decisions were great. I mean, they listened to the economic experts and developed one of the fastest growing economies in Asia. Today, Korea, it's the fourth largest economy in Asia, 10th or 11th in the world, depending on whose numbers you're looking at. But it's with that, they still have that remnant, I think, in the government bureaucracy, their heavy-handed nature that they know best. And when we're talking about technologies where nobody really, or at least the people I talk to don't understand them yet, it's very hard for a government regulator to understand. So I think encouraging more discussions with industry, not just U.S., but the Korean companies, Samsung and SK Hynix are the best in the world at what they do, would produce better regulations.
So all of you work with or advise tech sector companies that are looking at these issues in Korea, elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific. I want to kind of drill down to the impact that these policies have. I'm just curious to hear all of your thoughts on how does this shape investment decisions? How does this shape market entry, deployment of new products and services? Really trying to understand the tangible impact that these policies can have on innovation and on economic outcomes.
I mean, a fun part of the Korea project was identifying and elevating the trade-offs involved in Korea's overly aggressive and discriminatory approach to competition policy. And it was interesting because you can only really find that out through interviews of folks involved. Like looking at a tariff and the size of it, you can very easily assess the impact. But when it comes to non-tariff barriers, you need to peer behind the curtain and talk to folks to see how it impacts their operations and how the KFTC seizing office space for weeks at a time and seizing staff and computers disrupts their ability to conduct normal services. Overly broad data and information requests, including source code, including data that's held in other jurisdictions that they want within like 24, 48, 72 hours. And then there's the reputational effect that without due process, access to due process during the course of an investigation, the firm's reputation gets dragged through the mud, and then they finally get access to a court at the end of it. And it still takes them another year or two to sort of clear their name. But by that time, sort of reputational damage has been done. And if that happens again and again, then the operational impact, and it grows to a point which was an interesting but challenging part of the project, was bringing these threads together as like, how does this amount to a actual non-tariff protectionist barrier to trade? Because like a lot of folks involved in this, like, oh, this is just regulatory day-to-day course of business. Like, no, when you put the pieces together over a long enough time frame where you've got clear data and you can put Korea's conduct in the broader comparative lens against Japan, the US, and even the EU, and you can see that it's unique and that what it's doing is discriminatory on the face of it. And so, but to put the lens out further is like, I don't envy the regulators' perspective. Like they are focused on their domestic sort of sovereign tasking, but their world now is both domestic and international simultaneously. And as they're coming up with new rules and regulations, they can't just operate in a vacuum. Like these things, what the KFTC is doing now has geopolitical and trade implications from the get-go. And so that's really challenging. And that's the same thing with Vietnam and its AI law. Like it would love to be left alone, but like to do what it wants to do, but like there are automatic externalities given the distributed nature of digital technologies and what they're considering on localized AI infrastructure that has to be based in Vietnam. And if it's a public service, public agencies have to submit a plan to migrate from foreign cloud providers to domestic cloud providers. Like, what does that do to inference in AI models? What does that do to the development and deployment of AI? What does that do with the fact that they want to rush towards implementation before there's international standards on conformity assessment, on AI standards, on evaluations, on guides? Like, there's a need to sequence what they do domestically with the internationally to get towards that place of best practice and that place of interoperability. And that's really challenging. And it requires all of us to be engaged in the process to try and help them get there. But it's a challenging process to try and navigate.
I would also note that I believe someone mentioned this morning the national trade estimate that USTR does on our top trading partners. I think it's due out today or tomorrow. And when President Trump launched his Liberation Day, he was waiving the 2025 national trade estimate. So we will be looking at that very, very carefully. And I guarantee you Korea is going to have quite a bit on an aggressive KFTC and on discriminatory practices towards U.S. digital services.
I think both of those answers are very thorough. Companies, especially large companies, are used to dealing with the companies, especially large companies, are used to dealing with the regulatory challenges. The rules have varying impact on different companies depending on how they're architected. So, for example, there used to be in Singapore a complete ban on use of cloud computing by the banking sector there. It wasn't viewed as a reliable technology. Well, that had a very different effect on a company like Salesforce, for example, that at the time was truly cloud-based and was doing dynamic movement of technology and did not have the option to store data locally or create confined networks. So regulations can remove business opportunities whole scale for companies and have very significant and differing effects depending on what the technology model is. The other thing I don't think regulators always think through is local dependency on different technologies. So there's a lot of interest in leaning into cybersecurity, cybercrime issues around platforms and increasing liability of platforms. But things that raise costs for those providers or cause them to move out of markets also have ramifications, for example, for small companies in those markets that may use Facebook as their only advertising media in the market or their main platform for getting to their own customers in the market. So shutting things down has a broader impact than just on a single company that may be the target of a regulation.
All right, and being mindful of time, I'll go ahead and open it up to any questions from the audience. Yes, please. We'll get a mic over to you.
Thank you. Tammy or other members of the panel, could you comment on what's been referred to as the Korean dilemma, which is the argument about being safer with nuclear weapons of their own versus having American forces in the country defending them? Thank you.
That's really a question not for Andre. I'm sitting here, I'll take a stab at it. And I think, while there certainly is interest among certain folks in South Korea of having their own nuclear weapon, I think they're more interested in, again, ensuring the reliability that the U.S. will honor our commitments. But right now, the President Trump in the Gyeongju summit agreed to allow South Korea to build nuclear subs, which they are very interested in, and frankly would serve the U.S. well. It would serve us as well. Having the ROK, the ability to keep an eye on things around China would be helpful. And they also would like the opportunity to reprocess spent fuel. Again, they've got nuclear reactors and they've got a lot of spent fuel that they would like an opportunity. And I see that as an area of, I know we've had teams in Korea and meeting in Washington discussing that further. Ambassador, would you like to give the correct answer?
Well, your answer has been more than correct.
Okay. He's very kind. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions from the room?
I want their coffee.
We've got two.
Just a quick question. Wondering if the coupon issue was somehow related to the Hyundai plant in Georgia and the big fiasco, and whether that set off a sort of a tit for tat or.
So for those of you who don't know, sorry, on early September, as part of President Trump's sort of dual priorities of taking care of immigration and investment, we had a major ICE raid on a battery, an EV battery plant in Georgia, and 317 rule-following professional South Koreans. These were electrical engineers. They were, battery experts. They are here trying to get this battery plant up and running so that once it's operational, they will hire 6,008. It's going to create 6,800 jobs in Georgia. And coincidentally, I happened to have been invited by the World Affairs Council in Atlanta the week after the raid. And so lots of questions about the raid. And there was a Georgia reporter who said, why are Koreans stealing our jobs? And I started laughing. I said, well, first of all, you don't know the cost of an airline ticket from Seoul to Atlanta. I mean, it's $1,800. They're not coming over here to pour cement. These are trained experts that have a skill set building EV battery plants, electric vehicle battery plants, that Americans don't have that skill set. We don't know how to do that. Now, when they come over, they are doing job training, and they're going to do management and technology transfers. But we got to get them here and let them do their job. I was on I hosted Ambassador Kang Kyung-hwa last week at an event on Capitol Hill where she was talking about that, and she said that that most of those citizens were under the B1, B2 visa, and it's unclear if that was legal or not. So clearly, we have to find a way to let these folks, because again, Korea is already a huge investor in the U.S. All of these companies have major expansion going on, and they've got to have their people going in and out. And I think we're making progress. We do have a special team at the embassy now in Seoul that will help these groups. But, we also have to make the Koreans themselves and their families, their wives, feel that they're going to be, their spouses are going to be safe and secure and not arrested. And, on national TV, that video where they were shackled and treated like common criminals, that was appalling to people in Korea. I was shocked. I was like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? And the U.S., we did the right things. We sent a deputy secretary of state to Seoul to apologize, and President Trump got involved, and hopefully it will be better. But I don't equate that at all with what happened with Coupang. Coupang, again, it certainly not the only data leak, but I think Coupang, it's an American company. The chairman is a Korean American, and they did some things that are not the way a Korean company would have handled it. And I think that has irritated the Korean. I mean, Ambassador Anna and I were speaking at lunch about an old case we remember many years ago called Lone Star, where Lone Star bought a failed Korean bank, turned it around, tried to sell it for $6 billion. This was going to be a great success story, but because they didn't do things the Korean way, they didn't violate any laws, but they really offended the Korean people. That deal didn't go through. And we were lamenting. I was on the Lone Star arbitration witness list for years trying to resolve this. So it's not always what's right or legal or illegal. If you offend the Korean people, that can make your life very, very difficult. And we've seen a couple of examples of that, but I don't equate them at all. Just bad timing and maybe some questionable decisions.
Yes, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thanks for the panel. Great comments and a lot of questions probably about trust and kind of what that means in here. But let me throw one out here in terms of these barriers that exist or countries that may want barriers to be put in place. So as I see it, you've sort of got in the mix, you've got the U.S. in all its trade things, including the 301, the NTE that's going to come out. But you also have these cooperative mechanisms, also with some enforcement, the CPTPP, with 12 countries, including now the UK. You don't have Korea as part of that, but they want to be part of it. You've got ASEAN with 11 countries that came up from the Philippines discussion earlier today. You've got the Digital Economy Partnership with 4 countries, including Korea, which has now joined that. And then, of course, you've got the EU also on the other side, sort of saying, hey, do things maybe our way. So who has the clout in this? Or really maybe really the question is less who has the clout, but is there any interrelationship among these things? And are there tools collectively that may solve some of these barriers and challenges that any one entity or country may not be able to do on their own?
I like the fact we're not contributing to our collective depression with that question, and it biases my own preference towards looking towards the constructive elements of this. It's a good question, and I had some notes here from Laura's point, hearing from folks in the region and how geopolitics is impacting how policymakers view US tech at this critical moment, and it's turning them away from considering US tech. As they choose cloud service providers and AI models and such as they deliberate. And so just to mention that there's a very active shift on trust perspectives, and it's playing out towards how do they look to work together where they do. Various elements, what you mentioned. And I mean, for those of you that have been engaged in the region, whether at APEC, which I've been doing for 20 years now, or ASEAN, like there is still constructive energy and action happening. I'm currently involved in an effort at ASEAN to build common cloud principles across the region, which will deal with data classification, cybersecurity, government access to data. And surprisingly there, ASEAN has adopted a Cross-Border Cloud Computing Initiative, which is essentially a local adaptation of OECD Trusted Government Access to Data principles, because they recognise that they can't operate the workloads in a single country. Like Singapore is just running out, and so, but they need to build verifiable trust mechanisms with their partners so that as workloads and cloud services and data moves, that they know how it's going to be treated and respected. And so DEEF is another example of positive momentum. Maybe it's not as ambitious as we would like, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. The CPTPP is another example. And it's obviously actively in play now as countries adjust to the demise of the WTO and the US as a trusted and predictable trade partner. And so there are enough elements around and tools and initiatives that still allow folks to constructively work together because they recognise that they need to work together and to integrate or build interoperable frameworks to these issues. It's just that whether that momentum provides escape velocity from the national security, economic security, control-oriented tech sovereignty concerns like a China model, does that provide enough to get out? Like, and what does that dynamic look like between the folks involved in that debate versus the folks involved in that debate? And so we, again, collectively, all of us, NBR and others, can obviously only help the former in saying, like, what's at stake here is your future in a global digital economy that is ever going to be ever more interconnected, and that when you make these decisions, you have to be conscious of the trade-offs and that they need to be proportionate and necessary. And so I try and remain positive despite the geopolitical turmoil, and that there's still enough policymakers, especially in my favourite region of Southeast Asia, that are pragmatically oriented and that they realise they need to like find a balanced approach to it because they want the opportunity of trade and technology.
It's a good question, Ambassador Holliman. And sticking with the positive here, I don't see this region pivoting away from trade. I had a colleague in a consultancy that's not at this table use the term mini lateralism, and I think that's exactly what's happening. And I think that's a very positive and constructive and necessary thing. The one problem is that mini lateralism is probably not great for the technology sector and for cloud and for data transfers and for supply chains. Well, maybe it's good for supply chains, but there is a conflict, as Nigel mentioned, in in digital sovereignty, these national security issues, and the evolution of mini lateralism. So maybe we're going to end up creating networks that are separate, but they're contained within specific regions, and they're confined to our friends, and friends and enemies get defined differently. But trade for sure will continue, and I think this is evidenced, and partners and allies will begin to develop differently. Maybe that's not a bad thing.
All right. Well, we are unfortunately just slightly over time, and we've got very exciting remarks and then a fireside chat with Congresswoman Del Bene coming up. So want to make sure that we keep that on schedule. I'd like to thank Nigel, Tammy, and Laura for their insightful comments. As Nigel noted, we've got some exciting research that he put out over there. So encourage you to check out our publications table. But thank you to all our panelists.